Israel, an ally to Cyprus and Greece, economics, business, security, and trade, as well as cultural diplomacy, among others. Today, I have the distinct pleasure to have with us Professor Ben Moore, who's an associate professor of political science from the University of Haifa in Israel, and he will give us his insights with regards to a lot of questions that come to our mind. My name is Marios Eftimiopoulos. I'm the CEO of Strategy International, and this is Prime Analysis. Professor Moore, welcome to our show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's go straight to the main discussion. Things are a bit different these days in Israel. There's a lot of change with regards to the nature of crisis that is happening within Israel. Can you give us a few details?
Well, we have to address this crisis, which many people perceive to be the gravest crisis that Israel has had, even more than the October 1973 war. It began with seemingly just a reform of the judicial system in Israel. This is a pet project of the current justice minister, who is a member of the Likud party, Yariv Levin, and Simcha Rotman, who is the chairman of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee of the Knesset, where bills are prepared for legislation and then pushed forward to the Knesset. And it began with the idea of reform. This was also the terminology used. But after the government began working and the legislation was initiated, it became quite clear, I think, to everyone that this was much more than just a reform. First of all, the changes introduced and the changes that are still to be introduced are very sweeping and would mean a basic overhaul of the Israeli judicial system. It might be a regime change. Most people, in fact, in the opposition believe this is a form of regime change. And second, the pace of legislation was so incredible that there was little time for comprehensive conversation and maybe the construction of some joint understanding between the coalition and the opposition. The laws seem to be pushed through the system at breakneck speed. Even the Israeli president pleaded with Netanyahu to slow down the pace of events, but this did not happen. In addition to that, one has to say there were more laws in the pipeline that have less to do with judicial reform, so-called reform. The first type of laws is to push Israel more in the direction of religious legislation, a theocratic state. And second was to facilitate the operation of the IDF in the West Bank.
So it does have implications.
It has very serious implications about the stability of the West Bank, hence regionally as well.
We'll come back to the foreign policy.
Yes. Now, in response to what was happening, a grassroots movement began protesting the changes, and it picked up speed very quickly. The high-tech sector, which is the backbone of the Israeli economy, began moving funds and operations abroad. The shekel declined in value. And another sector of Israeli society, a very important one, these are the reservists, volunteer reservists of the Israeli Air Force, took action which is really exceptional. In Israel, they announced that they would refuse to come for their periodical training. This has never happened before, certainly not on such a scale. Now, there were many petitions being circulated on the part of various professionals in Israel and abroad, economists, lawyers, arguing that this was no less than regime change and that it would undermine Israeli democracy, asking the prime minister to stop the legislation. There was an air, a sense of violence on the streets. People began talking freely and openly, they still do, about a civil war.
A civil war?
Yes, that has been circulating now. This was a pair of words that was never used in Israeli rhetoric, but now it's on everyone's lips. So the idea itself is becoming normalized, which is very dangerous.
I have a lot of questions coming into this, but I think it would be good. Maybe we can give it a bit more, a few minutes into what you're saying before I go to the foreign policy on the judicial overhaul. So I just want to come back to what you mentioned with regard to civil war. I mean, that's a strong word. It's a strong sense of how people think. I mean, I want to, if possible, I want to connect it with my follow-up question, if you want. That it is, there's definitely a judicial overhaul, as I see it, at least from the basic elements that you have mentioned so far. So these have definitely foreign policy implications. When somebody refers to a possible sequence that may lead to a civil war, then it definitely has foreign policy implications, both regionally and globally. So what's your intake on this?
Well, I have to say that initially the Netanyahu government argued that this was an entirely domestic matter, domestic Israeli matter. This was also the communication that went out to the U.S. on this matter when President Biden expressed dissatisfaction with what was going on. And, technically or narrowly speaking, this is true. Israel is a sovereign state, and sovereignty means you are allowed to change your system as you see fit. But I think this is not the point of contention. Clearly, it's Israel's right to change the system as it sees fit, but we have to be prepared for a series of consequences or repercussions in the immediate area and beyond it.
Can I challenge you a bit on this?
Yes.
Some people claim that whenever there is a domestic issue within Israel, it has this ability to export this domestic element into its regional approach. Is this what you're actually implementing, that we need to be ready for precautions with regard to foreign policy? Or if it's only a political or diplomatic element, what are we to see with regards to foreign policy? And we will come to cases, but I just want to know the strategic value of it. I mean, will they reevaluate the strategic posture of Israel in the Middle East or in the world? Or will it be specifically targeted into specific, areas or countries?
No, I think what I want to emphasize are the unintended consequence of this reform. In other words, it's not part of the Israeli strategy. It is really contained domestically.
Okay, so it's still...
But there are spillover effects that are unavoidable. When a major actor in the Middle East falls apart, if its economy declines, if its national power declines, then this upsets the balance of power in the Middle East and, of course, has implications for realignments and for the responses of friends and allies in the region. Second, there is a problem with Israeli identity as far as the US and EU are concerned.
Right.
So we may think about interests only, and in that sense the interests are still there, they have not changed, but identity is also important in international relations, the soft power element. And we already see pushback from the US, we see pushback from the EU, just by the mere fact that Israel is slipping into turmoil, into turbulence.
So you believe that this turmoil is the one that makes them reluctant vis-a-vis Israel?
Well, it's the fear, the uncertainty that surrounds it, plus the fact that if Israel wants to remain within the Western democratic camp, it cannot do so while dismantling its own democracy.
Yes.
Another problem, which I think runs throughout the whole crisis, is what is going to happen in the West Bank.
Right.
If the issue were contained within Israel's Green Line 1967 borders, then perhaps the repercussions would not be that severe, although, again, when a country like Israel implodes from the inside, there are repercussions. But we're talking about the West Bank, and as I mentioned earlier, an important item on the agenda of the the religious Zionist Party. It has 14 members in the coalition, and its agenda goes way beyond judicial reform.
Yes.
So if the settlement project, for example, is enhanced, if it's strengthened, if the Palestinians resist, and there is a breakdown in the West Bank, this is certainly going to have effect, first and foremost on Jordan, but then on Egypt and actually every other Arab state.
Okay.
Even, I just add one point, even if we are very cynical about leaderships and we say all they care about are interests, the pressure is going to come from the street, from public opinion. Which is,
so public opinion on the one hand requires democratic values, on the other hand they want more engagement with regard to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, I presume. But then there's a fear that this may be exported with regard to the West Bank, but at the same time how the Palestinians will take it, because the Israelis might take it in a different way, so it becomes a bit more complicated. That's what I've understood.
Yeah, if you look at Jordan, for example, whose stability, of course, depends on the Palestinians residing in Jordan. If they take a side, if they're very strongly affected by what happens in the West Bank, then the Jordanian regime is going to be destabilized. Take Egypt as another example. The Egyptian-Israeli peace is a cold peace. It's a peace between elites. There's a lot of security cooperation, and of course Egypt has stepped in as a moderator in its relationship with Hamas in Gaza. But the peace is not popular on the Arab street. So if sympathy towards the Palestinians leads to riots within Egypt, then I'm not sure what the Egyptian government can do and how long and for how long the peace accord between Israel and Egypt can be sustained. So it's pressure bubbling from below. This is the major
I will come back maybe to the bilateral relationship, or maybe the Abrahamic Accord by the end. But I just want to divert a bit the discussion into a very known element that I'm pretty sure all of us know about it, but it's a relationship with regards to Iran and the international agenda on Iran, and how Prime Minister Netanyahu responds into this. So he has consistently put the Iranian issue in the international agenda. Lately, we've been seeing a very good collaboration between Mossad and the Greek security forces, averting a possible terrorist act within Greece, therefore showcasing somehow the good collaboration on the one hand, but on the other hand, the volatility that Israeli interests may be, and Greek interests in that case may be, and I add into this the Cyprus interests. So Prime Minister Netanyahu at some point put the Iranians again and the regime as a prime reason for this possibility of a terror attack. So where are we standing now to this issue? What is the solution? Are they going to any kind of negotiation for possible peace, or are they going to make these threats real on either side? Where do we stand? And consider that Iran now has a very good ally, which is called China in this case. So where do we stand on Iranian-Israeli relations and vice versa?
Well, there's no doubt that Netanyahu has made a career out of the Iranian threat. Over the past several years, he has been, as you said, at the forefront of the international effort to curb the Iranian nuclear program, maybe bring it to an end. But since this government came to power, publicly, there is no discussion of the Iranian issue. Netanyahu seems to be fully consumed by two things. The so-called judicial reform on the one hand, and a variety of laws that would allow him to stay in office despite corruption charges and so forth for the long run. And the timing is a bit odd, because As you know, Iran's breakout time has now been reduced to about 12 days to 14 days.
Yeah.
This compared to 1 year when it was subject to the security regime and inspection of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, from which Donald Trump withdrew in 2018 as a result of the urging and support of Netanyahu. So it seems like the Iranian nuclear program has turned a corner, and Netanyahu is just not there. He does not seem to have returned to this issue ever since he assumed power.
Can I just ask a question on this? But in the middle there were elections, if I'm correct, and the elections were not coming up with a government or a coalition government, so it took quite a while. Okay, considering now that Prime Minister Netanyahu is again as a prime minister, so you actually think that he will try to continue, but then again he lost time. That's what you're implementing?
Well, isn't time of the essence here when Iran is so close to a bomb? I agree that there's probably a little more time than just the breakout time, because you have to assemble the bomb itself if you decide to do so, and of course you have to deploy the delivery vehicles, and looking at the time framework, it's probably a few months. But the elections were November 1st, the government was sworn in December, and we are in April. And the issue just does not seem to reappear. It is true that from time to time we hear news about Israeli interceptions of weapon supplies from Syria into Lebanon. So apparently this kind of activity continues. But if you compare where the Iranian issue was on the national agenda prior to the elections and now, it's as if it's been silenced. So unless, of course, there are things behind the scenes of which we don't know.
Such as China, Iran, maybe? Or the attempt
I'm
Iran.
more thinking about the U.S. China is not going to play a role in case Israel goes forward with the decision to attack Iran in some form or another. You need American cooperation for that. And what we see are relations deteriorating between the White House and Netanyahu. So,
but they both claim that their relationship is ever stronger.
I think this is more public diplomacy. There is a lot of dissatisfaction in the White House from the direction that Netanyahu is taking Israel. And given the importance of the Iranian issue for Netanyahu himself, this should have been the time where relations between the U.S. and Israel were closest. Instead, they are arguing, mind you, that Netanyahu has not been invited to the White House still. It's 3 months. This is unprecedented. There is a real crisis of faith between the White House and the Israeli Prime Minister.
I want to play a bit devil's advocate, but the United States also deals now with Russia and Ukraine.
True.
So maybe they don't have so much time to invest in the typical diplomatic relationship that both countries should have. But then again, it is also the case that Israel has invested a lot into the Abrahamic Accords and the possibility of normalization of relations with the Arab Gulf, which may be seen as an opportunity for Israel to take the lead versus the United States has been taking the lead overall with different packages coming in. A second scenario may include also the United States coming in with a package that may include the whole East Med, and that includes also the Cyprus issue, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and maybe the more stabilization of areas that need actual stabilization, which is like Syria or financially Lebanon or so on and so forth, in order to avert a maybe greater role, keeping in mind that China is now ever engaged than before with regards to not only politics but also business, and it seems that they're coming in strong. So the question is a very clear-cut question. Do you anticipate that although Iran does not play a major policy element with regard to Israel and what's happening inside, also probably of the domestic issue taking place in Israel, do you think that there will be an actual armed conflict with Iran? And if so, who takes sides and who becomes an ally of who?
Well, thinking about that is very worrying, isn't it? If this indeed happened. I actually think the odds are against this kind of development, but I think we should consider three different types of scenarios. Two of them I don't think will happen, or there's a lower likelihood, but the third worries me more. The first scenario is an Iranian attack on Israel in some form or another, in collaboration with its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas. The Iranian reasoning may be that Israel is very weak now. It no doubt follows Israeli politics very closely. It sees the fractures, not just in Israeli society, but also within the military. This is unprecedented. So if Iran feels it's on the rise and Israel is weak, it might be tempted to attack. Personally, I don't think this is going to happen unless Iran can shield itself behind nuclear deterrence, and it's too early for that. The risk is just too big. And of course, Iran is aware of the fact that Israel is a nuclear power, although one always has to add the caveat that Israel has never admitted to having nuclear weapons. But of course, I doubt there is anyone who doesn't think it has. So for the Iranian, this is a very big risk, and Israel is going to react fiercely should this occur. Yes. So the second scenario is that Israel will be the one to attack. And under power transition theory, it seems that some of the conditions are already approximated. Israel is becoming weaker.
So it needs a reason to be.
There is a closing window of opportunity, because once Iran becomes nuclear, has an atomic bomb, this of course will be a very strong deterrent. And as I think you hinted, there is the question of diversionary war. This is a very easy solution to Israel's domestic problem. It will rally society, rally around the flag effect, and it may save Netanyahu from what appears to be a very grim fate. So there is the temptation for Israel to do that as well. I think the General Staff will oppose it. I think the Americans don't want that kind of instability in the Middle East, which leads me to the third scenario. The third scenario is the one we are always concerned with, namely unintended escalation. Any small incident along the border with other. So if to use the old metaphor, the powder keg is there and all it takes is a match.
Right.
And that's what I'm most afraid of, especially since Israel is concerned so much with its domestic crisis that you don't feel the safety precautions are there.
I'm trying to follow up on my thinking coming up with the next question, trying to put the puzzle together. If this is the true case of those three scenarios that you just mentioned, I'm just trying to make it as simple as possible. You have regional approaches and regional allies that are your allies and your friends, with which Israel is doing everything in its possibilities to increase not only the role, but standards of collaboration, of being together and so on. Togetherness, people-to-people approach. My question is, what is happening? I mean, I'll take it regionally, okay? What is happening with the Abrahamic Accord? If we assume that everybody knows about these three scenarios, is there a future for the Abrahamic Accord? Because financially, we've been seeing an increase in both trade investments in and out of Israel, with the UAE, with other countries, Morocco, Egypt, Bahrain, goes on and on, either bilateral or because of the Abrahamic Accord. So where do we stand? I mean, this is a good reason for the Abrahamic Accord to fall apart. Any of the three scenarios. Because in any of the three scenarios, you have as a standard on case attack, either by mistake or intentionally, or because it is time for Iran to say that they will and they actually make their threat reality. So in all three cases, there is war. I didn't see peace at all. So the question is, where do we stand with the Abrahamic Accord? Because the Abrahamic Accord is the total opposite. The Abrahamic Accord has the idea of cultural diversity, inclusivity, understanding, respect, tolerance, coexistence. This is a very different story when it comes down to to the Gulf. Where do we stand on this?
Well, the three scenarios that we talked about are war scenarios, and they may not occur.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully they won't, but I think that even if they won't, and Israel's domestic crisis continues, then the accords are undermined. And you talk about this people-to-people cooperation and fostering a new atmosphere in the Middle East. All of this is, I'm sure, correct and applicable. But the situation has already become worse for Israel,
Yes.
given the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. These two great theocracies of the Middle East apparently seem to have exhausted themselves in the Cold War between them, and there is genuine goodwill on the part of each to at least take a break from the conflict. Whether it can be sustained in the long run, I don't know, because some core issues have to be resolved, and they haven't. But at least there is the goodwill. Now, the value of Israel to the Abraham Accords is, I don't think it's really soft power, but more hard power. Israel is a counterweight to Iran, a coalition consisting of Egypt, Jordan, and the members of the Abraham Accords, backed by the U.S. This is the balance of power in the Middle East. But what happens if Israel doesn't supply the goods? If it's no longer stable, if it is collapsing from within, and particularly if relations with the U.S. go south. Israel's biggest value, I think, for most Arab states, is that it is perceived, rightly or not, to be influential in Washington, and it may even prevent the Americans from their process of withdrawal from the Middle East. It would force the U.S. to stay in the Middle East. But if Israel cannot meet these tasks, objectives, or functions that it has within this alignment, then I think there is just goodwill is not enough, or public diplomacy or soft power is not enough. And you see other Arab states, including the Gulf states, warming up to Iran now. If a war breaks down, they will bear the brunt of it.
I mean, I think it's too early to discuss about the abilities of Iran in reality, because there is a momentum that is building up also for the elements of Iran. But I don't think personally, I don't think that it should concern us too much, because ultimately Iran has to find a way that either to balance things and end specific wars that it is engaged with, directly or indirectly, and then secondly, decide that whether it wants to be part of the international community. And I think, and although multiple times we disagree with China, China is part of the Security Council of the United Nations, so it does have the opportunity to take some sort of some steps. So as long as these steps concur with the United Nations, that rules and regulations, that should be fine. But the problem is also that we see China being very negative towards U.S. interests, for example, in being in Japan or South Korea and so on and so forth. And that is somehow translated also in the Middle East. And that what makes things a bit not stable, or to be considered not stable. So I want to stay a bit into this with regards to the Abrahamic Accords. You understand that the Abrahamic Accords did not so much include the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but the Israeli-Palestinian issue ultimately will have to be dealt also through probably the Abrahamic Accords, and probably an opening of discussion, not only in the tolerance of coexistence, but rather to the conflict resolution. What is a possible solution, in a nutshell, that could come about with Israel-Palestine? And what are, or if any, there are any repercussions considering all this volatility that exists now in the area?
Well, I think the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not on the table now. It's in fact as far removed from it as it ever was. Again, I go back to the structure of the coalition. Of course, if tomorrow there is a new government in Israel, the new possibilities open up. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the current government and you think about 14 members of the religious Zionist party, their agenda is to enhance the settlement project, to make a two-state solution impossible because of the settlements all over the West Bank. You know, right now there are about 750,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. If you look at the map, it is impossible to divide the territory without creating huge havoc. So they are in fact opposed to the two-state solution, and they hope that the settlement project will indeed make it impossible, not feasible. They are in favor of a one-state solution, on the other hand. And this one-state solution is not the kind that is talked about in the Israeli left, namely a state of all its citizens with equal right. Their one-state solution relies on Jewish supremacy, the annexation of the West Bank, and what do they hope or what do they think will happen to the Palestinian population? Well, our current finance minister, who comes from this party, Bezalel Smotrich, said two interesting things. In the more distant past, his solution was what he called voluntary transfer. In other words, the Palestinians will be gradually pushed out of the West Bank. Their life will be made so miserable that they will want to leave. And just in a recent state visit to Paris, he said, there is no Palestinian people. It is an invention.
There was a big thing in the international media as well. Yeah.
So it seems as if he thinks they will acquiesce in the Israeli occupation and the creation of an apartheid state in the West Bank. And so there is just no real proposal or real way by which the conflict can be resolved given these kinds of preferences and ideologies. If Netanyahu drops this group, if it leaves the coalition and is replaced by another party that is right now in the opposition, then perhaps one can see some prospect of a solution. But right now, I think there is no way this is going to be solved.
So you think that it's a purely political element with regards to who leads and how they lead, with regards also to their opinions that they come with forward, obviously. However, Israel inside has different dynamics also. It is not also political, but also cultural and religious dynamics. And that's another case because, as you said, the Palestinian issue is not easy to solve. But I think also that the moment has come, because somehow I also consider personally that the Cyprus issue has characteristics of the Israeli-Palestinian issue as a security issue. It has different operational characteristics, why it has happened, illegal invasion, and so on and so forth. But again, if you solve one, if I go to the solution actually straight and say if you solve one, then you create a momentum to solve the other one because it's your neighboring area. So somehow it would make sense, and people are very attentive to the idea of a two-state solution. But the positive thing to say is that more and more people are talking about two-state solutions, at least in the international community. At the same time, it seems that, as you correctly put, that within the domestic parts of Israel, it does in fact show that Netanyahu does not want to discuss the Palestinian issue. And I think also this comes out very clearly. And the third problem that comes along is that you are in an alliance with several countries. That includes also Cyprus and Greece. And I presume these are stuff that are not discussed with regards to the reality of the needs in the area. So let me just proceed with a question that do we need prominence, leadership, skills that are actually providing good partnerships, good affairs? And that will definitely follow up a bit on Cyprus, because recently we've seen the visit of the foreign minister of Israel along with the foreign minister of Greece for the trilateral. So when this trilateral happens, there are serious and important things that are being discussed, including also the interconnectivity for electricity, or for example the discussion on the East Med or joint military posture. And now we see also operationally that both secret services of Greece and I presume also Cyprus and Israel are working quite well. So do we really want to disturb this balance? So where do we stand? At least let's speak a bit on leadership, on partnership, on prominency. I mean, you partially answered it, but let's be a bit more straight. What sort of leadership does Israel need from any, like, give me the characteristics. Don't give me only personalities, which I understand your political view, but the personality matters, but the characteristics matter even more.
Well, these characteristics cannot be provided currently by Israel's prime minister. That's for sure. It's difficult for me to answer because one cannot really isolate the prime minister from the system in which he or she is embedded. And the problems in Israel have not begun. They have worsened, but have not begun with the current government. I remind you that this is the 5th election in 4 years that we have held.
Yeah,
which shows you that society is deeply divided. It's divided roughly into 2 equal groups, and we won't go into what exactly are the schisms, but they are very, very difficult to reconcile.
Yeah, they're very dynamic, many dynamics.
So the role of the prime minister, first and foremost, before he or she can take any of the objectives, take on any of the other objectives you mentioned, is to heal Israeli society. And we are very far from doing so. In fact, the divisions are becoming deeper and deeper. So obviously, the first thing one would require is a leader who can lead Israeli society out of the crisis. Netanyahu is not the one to do that. Only later can we speak about foreign policy, regional leadership, and so forth.
I would like at some point to discuss a bit about leadership, maybe in another series, because the way that Prime Minister Netanyahu is envisioned, at least with Greece and Cyprus, is very positive. Because in fact he's very close to the same interests, and both acknowledge the historical presence of Jewish Greeks and Jewish Cypriots being there for many years and centuries. And it is very important to know how it is. But one of the characteristics that I would add is that the Prime Minister of Israel, whoever this may be, is very close also to the East Med coalitions that we have, such as Israel. Having said about Cyprus, a last question before I close the series. Should Cyprus be concerned about the situation in Israel? And the reason I say this is because they're investing very highly in this trilateral.
In a word, yes, they should be concerned. They should be concerned because if there is no dramatic change within the coming weeks, Cyprus will be dealing with a different Israel. However, I think this is not a question of joint interests. The interests are there, and as you said, and I agree, Netanyahu has invested a lot in this alignment, in this cooperation, and there's no reason to think anything has changed.
Yes.
Okay, but I think Cyprus will be hard pressed in two respects to keep up this, even the warming up of relations. Number one, if Israel ceases to be a democracy.
Yeah.
And this is a critical issue, I think, for the EU. And I think, as we mentioned, Netanyahu is no longer invited to any European capitals. And Cyprus, being part of the EU, will have to clarify its position in terms of conducting intensive relationship with a country that is maybe a theocracy, maybe an autocracy. That's number one. Number two, as I've said many times, and I see this as the major threat, if there is an explosion in the West Bank, Cyprus will have to explain what its position is with respect to the Palestinians. And they have consistently supported the Palestinians. So this is going to put them in a tight spot of having to take sides. As soon as Cyprus criticizes Israel, it will find that the current Israeli government doesn't take criticism well. And there will be pushback. So what can Cyprus do right now? I think sit by the sidelines and wait, just like we all do. Picking up on something you mentioned earlier, I think there might be a very important mediation role for Cyprus to play, especially if Egypt is no longer capable of performing that role. Then Cyprus would present itself as a favorable party in the eyes of both sides, and maybe that can be its contribution. But this is a bit, in the longer run. It's hard to say right now how things are going to turn out.
Professor Moore, thank you very much for joining us in this web series. It was a pleasure having you here. Thank you all for watching Strategy International's web series. Please subscribe, follow, and like our YouTube channel and social media. This is Marios Eftimiopoulos. I'm the CEO of Strategy International, and this was Prime Analysis. And remember, impact makes a difference.